Good morning, everyone. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to you all for attending today's webinar. I really hope you're going to find this to be useful and informative. We've got a great attendance today, which goes to show that holiday pay is a hot topic. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Avril.Craig, and I'm the Payroll Director here at Henderson Logie. I work along a team of 11 dedicated payroll professionals, most of whom you can see here in this photo. I'm one of the founding members and I'm on the advisory panel of the Association of Bureau Managers. At HL, we look after payroll and pensions for around 500 clients, as well as offering consultancy services to clients who run their own payroll. We're also a BACS approved bureau. Our payroll team keep their technical knowledge up to date via continual assessment through the Payroll Centre ACT platform. So that's just a little background about us. Today's webinar. So today's topic is holiday pay. It's a topic that I could quite honestly talk about for days. And there have been so many changes and updates, and cases are still trundling their way through the courts. So this means there's likely to be further changes ahead. And of course, many changes mean there are more risks of getting things wrong. When new changes come along, we'll definitely update you and keep you abreast of that. Now, today, we've only got a limited amount of time on this webinar. I think I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so. So it's not an exhaustive presentation. It's impossible for me to cover all the detail. So what my intention is today is to focus on important headline areas. And we can go into more detail with you outside of this webinar if that's something you require. But today, the main things I'm going to cover, I'll be providing an update on current holiday pay regulations. We're going to review leave entitlement and holiday calculation rules for different types of employees and the various types of payment that affect holiday pay. We're going to talk about getting your processes and compliance right. And I'm hoping in the course of this, we'll clear up some of the many misconceptions that exist. As a follow-up to this webinar, I'm going to provide links to further detailed guidance, which should help you drill deeper into any queries that you might have. So, understanding holiday pay. Let's look at the essentials. The working time regulations in the UK include certain provisions for workers, including paid leave rights. So we'll have statutory annual entitlement. The working time regulations provide statutory right to all workers to take 5.6 weeks of paid annual leave. And this is made up of 4 weeks annual leave and 1.6 weeks additional leave. Now, there's a lot of background as to why it's split like this. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on that today. There really just isn't time. There are some differences in how the 4-week entitlement and the 1.6-week entitlement can be treated. And I hope this will come evident as I continue. But essentially, what we're determining here is that all workers are entitled to 5.6 weeks annual leave as a minimum. Now, you've heard me refer to workers. What is a worker? I'm saying workers are not employees. Now, obviously employees are workers, but you also have to consider other people who aren't employees for holiday pay. So an example is an individual, perhaps a self-employed contractor who performs work for you, services for you as a single employer for the duration of a project. These people are also entitled to paid leave and additional leave. Agency workers too need to be considered. So really it's a case of making sure your contracts, your definitions are all crystal clear and you know who within your organisation is and isn't classified as a worker. The links I provide as a follow-up will go into more detail on this. So calculating holiday pay. Now we know who gets holiday pay and how much the regulations say they must get. Let's look at how to calculate the holiday pay. There are specific calculation rules for the following types of leave. As I mentioned, statutory annual leave of 4 weeks, statutory additional leave of 1.6 weeks. There's also contractual leave, which is basically any extra leave you choose to provide to your workers. Looking at the annual entitlement, I've said this is 4 weeks. So as an example, if you work for 5 days a week, that means you have 20 days annual leave. Now, some employers prefer to express annual leave in hours rather than days or weeks. So if the worker works 35 hours a week, their annual entitlement is 140 hours. It's really up to you as an organisation to decide how this best works for you. It depends on the nature of how your employees are paid, what's in the contracts, and really just works best for you as an organisation. Additional leave, this is the extra 1.6 weeks. So again, if you work 5 days a week, that translates into 8 days annual leave or 56 hours of annual leave. So to sum up, this 5.6 weeks of statutory leave can be expressed in weeks or days or hours, depending on what works best for you as an organisation. So the two statutory leave amounts, quite often employers will combine these. The working time regulations talk about these types of leave separately, but together they constitute the statutory minimum leave, and it is very common for employers to combine these and treat these as one set of statutory leave, really for simplicity's sake. Otherwise, you end up trying to do different calculations for the 4 weeks and the 1.6 weeks. And that means trying to track when an employee is on leave, are they taking part of the 4 weeks holiday or part of the 1.6 weeks? So as I say, just for ease of operations, most employers will combine these two statutory entitlements. On top of this, we've got contractual leave. This is extra holidays that you've granted to your employees over and above the statutory minimums. So essentially, we'll have statutory holidays and contractual leave. And the statutory holidays are split into two elements, 4 weeks and 1.6. So hopefully that for you defines the types of leave that you can provide to your employees. Let's look at carrying forward holidays and payment in lieu of holidays. Now, a worker's contract will define how many days leave they can carry over into the next holiday year. So if a worker gets the statutory 28 days leave, they can carry over a maximum of 8 days. And again, that can be expressed in hours if that works best for you. If a worker gets more than the statutory 28 days, well, just say you've given them 2 or 3 days extra contractual leave, their employer may allow them to carry over any contractual untaken leave. The employment contract or company handbook should spell this out. But as regards to the statutory leave, the maximum that can be carried over is 8 days. Now, there are more detailed rules where we come to workers who are on sick leave, long-term sick leave, parental leave, maternity leave, all these kinds of scenarios. There's different rules that work out how much holidays can be carried over. We also need to consider situations where the worker was not given the opportunity to take the leave. Again, it's possible for more to be carried over, but there's detail in the guidance on that. Looking at payment in lieu of holidays. I've had many difficult conversations with employers on this matter. So when it comes to the end of the holiday year, it's an absolute rule that you cannot pay out any untaken statutory leave. Accrued leave can be paid out if someone leaves or when they leave their job. They've maybe got a week's holiday left over and you pay that out on their final pay, and that's acceptable. Contractual leave, this is anything over and above the statutory days. Contractual leave can be carried over and that can be paid out too. These are the only circumstances in which an employer can pay out untaken leave. holidays, and the working time regulations are very clear on this actually. Holidays are not there for financial gain, can't be saved up, can't be cashed in. They are there for the purpose of ensuring that your employees have adequate rest and recuperation. So please be very careful about this. You should monitor holiday pay balances regularly and ensure your employees are taking their break. It is an expectation on employers. And from what I've heard, that expectation is going to be elevated a little bit. So good to build that into your systems now. So just a little bit on when leave can be taken. Now, usually the employment contract or the handbook will lay out procedures for holiday booking and approval, but there are some statutory rules to consider. So again, working time regulations sets out if a worker wants to book certain time off, the employer requires the employee or the employer requires the employee to take certain time off. Perhaps you're closing down at Christmas. Notice must be given for at least twice the duration of the required leave. So if someone wants a week's leave, they've got to give you a minimum of 2 weeks notice. If you want to refuse a holiday, you'd have to give your employee notice of at least the duration of the leave before the start date. So if someone's booked a week off, a week ahead of that, you have to give them notice that they can't take that leave. I'm pretty sure that'll be pretty exceptional circumstances, but at least you know that you do have the right to do that. And this gives the employer a bit of control over when leave is taken. Look at the leave year. When an employee starts with you in their first year of employment, their holidays should be accrued month by month, 1/12 per month. So this is to prevent them taking more leave than they've actually earned at a given point. So they're accruing it month by month, and then you know how much they're entitled to before you pay anything out. Careful calculations and more precise calculations will be needed in certain situations. For example, if the employee starts and leaves in the middle of the year or starts towards the end of the year, maybe that 1/12 calculation isn't accurate enough. So a more precise accrual method might be necessary. So what is the leave year? In most cases, most organisations will have their leave year defined, and it'll state it in the employee contract. So common leave years are January to December, something that coincides with the financial year or perhaps the tax year. Now, if you haven't provided a definition in the contract, the holiday year defaults to the anniversary of their start date. Now, this applies to employees starting after 1st October 1988. Slightly different rules for employees starting before then. Again, you'll be able to see that in the guidance. So defining your leave year on an organisational level is really important for lots of reasons. I mean, for one example, how difficult would it become to manage multiple leave years when every employee's got a different cut-off point? So make sure that your organisation has defined a leave year. What's included in holiday pay calculations? There are basically two main aspects to holiday pay. The first is entitlement, in terms of how many weeks, days, hours employees entitled to. And the second element is what's the value of that. Now we understand a bit about leave entitlement that I've just gone over. Now we're going to look at how much a week's holiday pay is worth in monetary terms to your employee. This is one of the areas in holiday pay where we've seen most changes in recent times. What actually gets included in holiday pay calculation? Now, if your employee gets paid a regular fixed weekly wage for regular fixed weekly hours, then it's really quite simple. They take a week's holiday and they get paid a week's basic pay for that week that they're off. But what if your employees have several other pay components in addition to their basic pay? Historically, it was acceptable to only calculate holiday pay on basic pay. However, recent decisions by the European Court of Justice have challenged this and ruled additional pay components must be included in holiday pay calculation. Now, the whole premise of this is to ensure that no one loses out financially if they're on annual leave. The most common types of pay components to be included in holiday pay calculation are things like guaranteed overtime, non-guaranteed overtime, voluntary overtime. That's a fairly recent change. It used to only be guaranteed overtime. But cases going through the courts are changing the decisions all the time. If your employee receives commission, that has to be included in the average pay. Sometimes work-related travel and certain other allowances. Everybody's got different pay components, but that's just a bit of a snapshot of the sort of things that you'll have to consider paying, including in the average holiday pay calculation. And really the question to ask is, if they weren't on annual leave, would they be getting more money? So a week's holiday pay should therefore be a week's normal remuneration, and that includes all these holiday pay components. And I think an easy example to help people understand this is if you think about a car salesman who has a very small basic pay and gets most of his earnings from commission on car sales. Now, in a normal month, let's say he sells 20 cars a month. So he's got basic pay and commission on 20 cars. If he takes 2 weeks holiday, he's going to lose out half his commission because he's now only got time to sell 10 cars. So that kind of demonstrates, the thinking behind including average, the other pay components within holiday pay calculations. So I wanted to look also at working patterns. Whatever your employee's working pattern happens to be, a worker taking a week's holiday should receive, as I stated earlier, a week's normal remuneration. This is going to comprise their weekly pay plus things like overtime and commission. Looking at statutory leave, statutory paid holiday entitlement is limited to 28 days per annum, and that's based on someone working 5 days a week times 5.6 weeks. What if someone works 6 days a week? Well, actually, they're still only entitled to a maximum of 28 days statutory leave. You might decide to pay them more, but in terms of statutory minimums, they're still only entitled to 28 days. What if if you've got part-time staff, maybe they only work 3 days a week? So they'll still be entitled to 5.6 weeks, but it's 5.6 of their working week. So they would get 5.6 weeks times 3 days. So that brings their entitlement to 16.8 days. Again, your contract might provide for more, but essentially the 28-day entitlement is prorated according to the employee's work pattern. So here's a couple of examples to maybe help consolidate the understanding of this. Employees on basic fixed contracted hours will receive a week's pay when they're on leave. Employees who are on fixed contracted hours, plus they do a bit of overtime, for example, they'll receive an average of their weekly pay when on a week's leave. And this average includes the overtime. We've also got to think about irregular hours and part-year workers. These came into focus in recent times. Staff working in these sort of patterns, I'll come on to just in a little bit. I often get asked about bank holidays, public holidays. So we've discussed that statutory leave is made up of 4 weeks annual leave and 1.6 weeks additional leave, making a total of 5.6 statutory annual leaves. Now, bank holidays do not have to be paid in addition to this. The terms and conditions of employment should stipulate if bank holidays, I also mean public holidays with that definition, are included in the statutory leave, or if the bank holidays are in addition to statutory leave. So in recent times, we've had extra public holidays granted, for example, of the coronation. you as an employer, if your contracts define that the holidays are X number of weeks plus public holidays, in those scenarios, you'd have to grant your employees an extra day's leave that year. If your contracts state X number of holidays, including bank holidays, you don't have to provide that extra day. So you can see that the definitions and the terms of the contract are really important to get right so that it carries out your intentions. Now, extra leave, what I mean by that is contractual leave that's over and above the legal minimums. You can offer your employees as many holidays as you like above the legal minimums. It's important to note that they do not have to apply the statutory-based calculation rules on that extra entitlement. So if you give your employees 7 weeks holiday a year, let's say, the amounts over the 5.6 don't have to include that average calculation. But how complicated will that be to monitor that? How do you know which of the different categories of leave that your employee is taking? Is it the statutory? Is it the 4 weeks, 1.6 weeks? Are we going to really apply different calculation rules to all the different types of holiday? I think that's going to be a bit tricky. But it's, I just want you to know that that's possible. And it's really, whether it's practical or not, it's up to you. And your contracts need to be worded appropriately so that employees know what they get for their holidays. Now, I have mentioned average calculation already, so I want to look at that a bit deeper. We've already established that employees with, say, core weekly hours, whether full-time, part-time, salaried or hourly paid, they have their holiday pay calculated on a 52-week average. So holiday pay is calculated by reference to the last 52 worked weeks. It's important I emphasise that. It used to be 12, but essentially we look at the average pay, including all relevant pay elements, so overtime, commission, and so on, to determine the average weekly amount. And that is how much the holiday pay element should be. We can go back as far as 104 weeks to get a 52-week average. It's good practice to show the holiday pay element separately on the payslip, and that way you're not calculating holiday pay on a holiday pay average. So let's look now at irregular hours and part-year workers. This is subject to quite a recent update, actually. New guidance was issued in January 24. Now, this guidance applies to all holiday years commencing after the 1st of April 2024. If your holiday year starts before this date, the 52-week calculation rules apply to this category of worker. But for holiday years commencing after the 1st of April 2024, you can use a different method. So again, this is relating to people who work irregular hours, maybe like 0-hour contracts, and people that work part of the year. It could be someone, a seasonal worker, they maybe work over the summer, only work at Christmas, that kind of thing. So what employers can do is they can calculate annual leave entitlement as 12.07% of the hours worked or the pay received in a pay period for irregular hour workers and part-year workers. So that starts from the first year of employment and beyond. You also have the option to operate what's called rolled up holiday pay for this type of staff. And again, it's based on 12.07% of all earnings, including if there's any overtime or any other extras. You may remember that, a few years ago we were able to do this and it stopped, and now it's come back in. Now, if you opt to use rolled up holiday pay, again, this only applies to part-year or irregular hour workers. The calculation for rolled up holiday pay is 12.07%. What you're doing with rolled up holiday pay is you are adding that 12.07% onto their pay in the month that they actually earn it. So they're getting their holidays paid out as they go. And that's often more suitable for employees who are just working here and there, working randomly. They're not necessarily going to book a week's leave because they're in or they're not in working, if you see what I mean. And it's much easier for employers to manage that. The 52-week average calculation was pretty tricky for this type of employee. So I'm really glad to see that HMRC have brought this in. One thing though, you have to make sure your employees are aware that they're being paid for holidays as they go. And there's no further pay if they do happen to take a week's leave. So where does this 12.07% figure come from? Well, it's actually a proportion of the statutory holiday weeks and working weeks. So a statutory entitlement is 5.6 weeks. We've established that. It's 52 weeks in a year. So if we deduct this 5.6 from 52 weeks, we're left with 46.4 weeks that an employee can work. So a percentage of the worked weeks is 12.07%. That's how much the holiday proportion is for these employees who get 5.6 weeks annual leave. Now, one thing to remember is that 12.07% is based on the statutory entitlement. And what that means is, if you offer your workers more than the statutory entitlement, maybe you get 6 weeks, 7 weeks holiday year, you need to use a higher percentage to calculate their holiday entitlement. This January 24 guidance updated how to calculate holiday pay for this category of worker in the event of family or sick leave, long-term leave, maternity, all that sort of thing. There's not really enough time in this webinar to delve into the intricacies of that, but you'll be able to see in the guidance how it works for this type of worker. So these new rules provide a much more simplified method of holiday pay calculation for 0 hours, irregular hours, part-time workers. Not part-time workers, sorry, part-year workers, seasonal workers. You must remember that it only applies to them. You can't apply this to people who have contracted hours and do some extra. And you must also remember it only applies to holiday years that commence on or after the 1st of April 24. If your holiday year started in January, you still have to keep the 52-week average method in place until we get to January 25, the start of your new tax year. If you do decide to change from 52-week average to this method, you have to have good, clear communications sent out and agreed with your employees. And lastly, if you just remember that the 12.07% relates to 5.6 weeks holiday, if you give more holidays than that, then your percentage that you calculate this on will be bigger than 12.07%. On the face of it, holiday pay might seem to be straightforward. It can be in some cases, but often it's surprisingly complex. Some of the common complexities: how you work things for part-time workers, irregular hours, or 0-hour workers. If you've got people, a mix of people on this type of contract, and you've got people with contracted hours, are you working 2 different calculation methods? Have you actually identified your worker types? And do you know how to deal with holiday pay in each case? Is it 52 average, rolled up 12.07%, part-time, full-time, shift workers? You've got to really consider every single category of worker and get the system that applies to them. You also have to think about identifying what's included in the average calculation. A one-off bonus might not have to be included, but maybe a performance-related bonus would. It's a case of looking at every pay component and making that decision. When you're doing the calculation of 52-week average, you have to remember to exclude non-worked weeks in your average. So if someone's been off sick for 2 weeks and on holiday for 3 weeks, That's 5 weeks out of that 52 that you don't count in. So you've got to go back a little bit further to pick up 5 weeks from the previous period. So you really need a good system to capture that. Also, think about how do we differentiate between statutory and non-statutory entitlements? Are we just going to treat them all the same, as most people do? Do we want to have separate calculations? What do I do when there's an absence, maternity, long-term sick? How do I work holiday entitlement out then? So that's just a few of the complexities that employers really need to consider. Now, today, I've just really touched on the key points, to be honest, and there's a great deal of detail behind this, which, as I mentioned, I can't really cover today. But what I hope I've achieved is I hope I've given you all the headlines, and you'll see all more details in the links that we're going to follow up with. With all the changes in recent years, especially over the last 5 years, ensuring employees receive the correct holiday pay is more crucial than ever. So what we recommend employers do is they undertake a review. They evaluate their contracts, their systems, their procedures, how they categorise workers, what the entitlement is, how they work at average pay, just a holistic review across the organisation, even looking at holiday year dates. Just make sure that you're accurate, you're compliant, and your risk is managed, and you have safeguarded yourself against potential underpayment claims, because there's more cases going through court, and more cases could mean changes, further changes that, if you get your systems right, then you'll be ready for them. So I think I've demonstrated that holiday pay isn't just a standard admin payroll task. It sits outside of payroll, really, is deeply connected with other areas in your business, primarily HR, but also your finance function, all your documentation, categorization of workers. There's a lot of work to be done just to make sure it's right. So effective management of holiday pay requires viewing it as a dedicated function in its own right. So just to conclude what we're talking about today, the recent efforts to simplify matters, in the case of irregular and part-year workers, well, they're definitely welcome. However, as I said, case laws are still making their way through the courts, so there's probably some attention and some changes that are likely to come in the coming months or years. Oh, right, just bear with me. I just feel that holiday pay is something that needs attention, and it needs to be addressed in its own right. It's not just payroll, it's a strategic function. It requires alignment across the various departments in your organisation, and you have to be aware and stay updated on all the legislative changes that are coming along. And we're all busy in the day-to-day, and it can be difficult for employers just to keep on top of all of this. So I think that's enough from me. I've been sent quite a number of questions on this topic. I don't think I'm going to be able to cover them all. So I'm just going to pick up 2 or 3 that have come through already. I've been asked, do my employees accrue holiday while on maternity, paternity or sick leave? Well, the answer is yes. They continue to accrue holiday entitlement whilst on these leaves, including shared paternal leave and so on. It includes statutory annual leave and any additional contractual leave that you've provided for. How does holiday pay work for 0 hours or casual contracts? I've kind of gone over this, but you have the option from holiday year starting from the 1st of April 24. You have the option to move away. Currently, you have to use a 52-week average, but you have the option to move over to the 12.07% or greater if you give a more generous holiday. What about shift workers? How does holiday pay work for shift workers? So this goes back to the principle that when they're on holiday, they should receive their normal weekly pay. So that includes any regularly worked overtime, shift allowances. The calculation varies depending on whether their shift worker has regular or irregular hours. So if someone's a regular hour worker, they'll get basic pay, they'll get bonuses, allowances, shift premiums. Their calculation for holiday pay should include an average of all these elements. And if they work a strange pattern, would work it out on a week, a full calendar week. So that would be Saturday to Sunday. Whatever they've earned in that week, that's how you work out their holiday pay. A regular shift hours, so people work variable hours. Again, it'll just be an average of their weekly pay. Differentiating between the statutory 4 weeks and the statutory 1.6. So the 1.6 weeks, it isn't a requirement to add the extra elements for overtime and commission and so on to the 1.6 weeks, but it's actually really impractical to separate them out. It isn't, it isn't compulsory, but really, why would you do separate calculations? It's not very practical. You want to be consistent and fair with your employees. And I think that kind of covers all the questions that I'm able to go through today. However, if you've sent in a question that I've not covered, I'm more than happy to follow up. I'll get details at the end of the webinar, and I can quite easily come back to you. So it only remains for me to say thank you for attending today. Really appreciate your attendance. As I say, we'll send links, follow-up guidance, and a recording of this webinar and the slides, so you can refer back to them. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to contact me directly, and I'll do my very best to help you. Thank you so much again today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.